The confrontation. The scent of expensive cologne lingered in the air as Darius King, a sharply dressed black man in his mid-30s, adjusted his tie in the lavish hotel restroom mirror. The tension of the high-stakes operation he was part of still weighed heavily on his mind. His immaculate suit was a symbol of the professionalism he prided himself on, and his FBI badge, tucked securely inside his jacket, was a reminder of the authority he commanded. A seasoned special agent, Darius was used to navigating intense situations, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. The bathroom door swung open abruptly, a rush of cold air preceding the arrival of a burly, middle-aged white man in a hotel security uniform. The man's demeanor was immediately hostile, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Darius, clearly sizing him up. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he barked, his voice laced with suspicion. Darius, momentarily taken aback, had no idea what to make of the situation. He was well aware of the subtle forms of racism he had encountered throughout his career, but this was something new. He had done nothing wrong, was in no way out of place, and yet the man's hostility was undeniable. "I'm with the FBI. I'm here for a conference," Darius said, his voice calm but firm, hoping that would end the interaction. The security guard, however, wasn't listening. "I don't care who you say you are. This area is restricted, employees only." The man took a step forward, clearly escalating the situation. His hand hovered near his radio, as if ready to call for reinforcements at the slightest provocation. Darius stood his ground, but the realization hit him like a punch in the gut. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This was about race. This was about a black man in a place where he clearly didn't belong in the eyes of the guard. Another security guard entered the restroom, his face contorted with suspicion as he joined the first. Now there were two of them, both closing in on Darius as if he were a threat, even though he was standing in a restroom, minding his own business. The tension in the air was palpable, and Darius could feel his pulse quicken, not out of fear, but out of frustration. He had been trained to handle high-stakes situations, to de-escalate conflicts, but this wasn't tactical. This was personal. "Step away from the sink," the first guard ordered, his tone becoming more aggressive, more commanding. "You need to leave now." Darius took a deep breath. He had seen this countless times before. People of color, regardless of their success, reduced to nothing more than their skin color. It was a harsh reality that he had learned to navigate, but today, in this moment, it felt especially unjust. As the second guard advanced, his hand drifting toward his baton, Darius made a choice. He reached slowly for his badge, pulling it from his jacket and holding it up for both guards to see. The gleaming golden eagle of the FBI badge caught the light. "Special Agent Darius King, FBI," he said, his voice steady. "You've got the wrong man." For a moment, the restroom fell silent. The guards blinked, clearly taken aback, unable to process what they were seeing. The black man, standing before them, wearing an impeccable suit and an FBI badge. The silence hung heavy in the air. Then, as if realizing the gravity of the situation, the first guard stammered, "Sir, we were just doing our job." Darius didn't flinch. He had no interest in hearing their excuses. His mind was racing, thinking about how, yet again, he had been questioned, harassed, and humiliated because of his race, despite the fact that he was a trained professional. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a painful reminder of the biases that still lingered in society. He turned, tucking his badge back into his jacket, and walked out of the restroom without another word. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he refused to look back. This wasn't over, and he wasn't going to let it go. The decision. The next morning, Darius found himself standing backstage, awaiting his moment to speak at the FBI's annual conference in Washington, D.C. The grand ballroom before him was teeming with agents, government officials, and media personnel, their voices blending into a hum of conversation. The tension in the room was palpable, as everyone awaited the keynote speeches and announcements. Cameras flashed, and reporters, pens poised, waited eagerly for the next big revelation. Darius had anticipated this event for months, but today, the usual excitement was clouded by a heavy weight on his chest. The events that had unfolded in the hotel restroom the day before were still fresh in his mind. He had tried to brush it off. After all, he was here to represent the Bureau, to contribute to discussions on national security, to share the success stories of the cases he had worked on. Yet, the humiliating encounter he'd endured felt like an insurmountable shadow hovering over him. What bothered Darius more than the guards' actions wasn't just the blatant racial profiling. It was the nagging realization that he had been, once again, reduced to a stereotype. No matter his education, his years of training, or his role in the FBI, he had been seen as an outsider, as a threat, simply because of the color of his skin. The sting of that injustice had lingered all night, and as he looked around the ballroom now, he knew that walking onto that stage without addressing what had happened would be a disservice to everything he stood for. This was not just about him. It was about every black professional who had been made to feel lesser, regardless of their achievements. It was about the countless instances of discrimination, big and small, that many chose to ignore or sweep under the rug. But Darius couldn't do that anymore. He couldn't be silent. Not after what he had experienced. Not when it was clear that this kind of discrimination was so deeply embedded in society. As he stood backstage, Darius's mind raced. He was moments away from stepping into the spotlight, but the weight of his decision bore down on him. Would his speech resonate with the audience? Would he face resistance, or worse, apathy? It didn't matter. He had already made up his mind. This was his moment to speak the truth, and he wouldn't let fear silence him. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd growing louder, signaling that it was almost time for him to step forward. His heartbeat quickened, but he closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The adrenaline was starting to build, but instead of feeling anxious, he found clarity. He was no longer just a man preparing for a speech. He was a man preparing to make a statement, to hold up a mirror to the very system he worked for. When the stage manager gave him the nod, Darius walked toward the podium with purpose. As he did, the room fell into an expectant hush. The faces of agents, politicians, and journalists were all fixed on him. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, capturing the moment he took his place at the front of the room. The spotlight illuminated Darius as he stood at the podium, his sharp suit and confident posture a stark contrast to the hostile environment of the restroom just 24 hours earlier. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to absorb the gravity of the situation. He was standing before some of the most powerful people in the country, the very people who could make a difference. He knew the audience was waiting for him to speak, but what they didn't know was that this wasn't going to be a typical speech. Darius took a deep breath and began. His voice was calm, but carried an undeniable weight. "What happened yesterday wasn't just about me," he said, his words cutting through the air. It was about how a person of color, regardless of his credentials, his authority, or his uniform, is still seen as a threat. The room was silent, save for the sound of a few pens scratching notes on paper. The room was filled with agents and government officials who had seen countless instances of racial discrimination on the news, but few had ever had it hit so close to home. Few had ever seen one of their own, an FBI agent, publicly confront such a harsh reality. "I was in that bathroom yesterday, wearing the badge of this country, representing everything that this bureau stands for. But instead of being respected, I was questioned, humiliated, and made to feel as if I didn't belong." Darius paused, scanning the faces before him. Some of them were looking down, unable to meet his gaze, while others stared at him intently, as though willing themselves to understand. "Let me be clear, this isn't just about one individual incident. It's about a systemic issue that runs deep in our society, a bias that infects every corner of American life. It's about how every black man, every person of color, is often assumed to be guilty until proven innocent. Yesterday, I wasn't just an FBI agent. I was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Darius could feel the tension rise in the room as he spoke, his words a challenge to the very system that had allowed such injustice to thrive. The subtle murmur of discomfort could be heard, as some began to process the reality of his words. This wasn't just a personal grievance, it was a rallying cry for change. The worst part of this situation, Darius continued, is that this kind of treatment isn't isolated. It happens every day to people who look like me. It happens to professionals, to leaders, to the people who are supposed to be seen as authorities in their fields. We are questioned in ways that white individuals are not. We are looked at with suspicion, even when we have the same credentials, the same experience, and the same dedication. Darius's voice began to rise, fueled by a mixture of anger and determination. We can no longer ignore this. We can no longer pretend that this is just a few bad apples in the system. This is a fundamental problem with the way we see each other. It's a problem that has been allowed to persist for far too long, and it's time for us to face it head-on. The audience was silent now, hanging on his every word. The discomfort was palpable, but it was also clear that Darius was not going to let the moment slip away. This wasn't just about a confrontation in a hotel bathroom. It was about dismantling the very biases that had shaped the way people viewed black professionals, especially those in positions of authority. I could have walked away yesterday. I could have ignored the humiliation, pretended it didn't matter, and moved on with my life. But I won't. I can't. Because the truth is that if I walk away and stay silent, nothing changes. And if nothing changes, then how can we expect progress? Darius's words were now ringing in the air, reverberating through the hearts of those who listened. He wasn't just speaking about the past, about what had happened to him. He was speaking about the future, about the kind of society that needed to be built. We have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to do better. We have to start listening to each other, and we have to start seeing each other. The repercussions. The next few days after Darius's speech passed in a blur of media frenzy, public outcry, and internal discussions within the FBI. What had begun as a solitary confrontation in the hotel restroom had snowballed into a national conversation about race, professionalism, and systemic inequality. Darius's words echoed throughout the country, sparking debates in boardrooms, living rooms, and online forums. The hashtag #ProfileInWarProtectors hashtag began trending, and stories of similar incidents, black professionals being racially profiled, questioned, or humiliated despite their credentials, began to surface, amplifying the voice Darius had given to this long-overlooked issue. News outlets scrambled to cover the story from every angle, some focusing on Darius's bravery in speaking out, others highlighting the controversy of the incident itself. The video of his speech quickly gained traction, with millions of views across social media platforms. By the end of the week, Darius had become the face of a larger movement for racial equality within professional spaces, and his name was being discussed on national talk shows, podcasts, and news panels. But for Darius, the increased attention was both a source of empowerment and a reminder of the painful journey ahead. While he appreciated the growing awareness, he also knew that this was just the beginning. The battle for real change was not one that could be won overnight, and he couldn't afford to let the momentum slow. On the surface, the FBI's response seemed appropriate. An internal investigation was launched into the incident, and the 2 security guards involved in the confrontation were placed on administrative leave. The Bureau issued a public statement condemning racial profiling and reaffirming its commitment to diversity and inclusion. Darius was invited to participate in a series of training seminars to help law enforcement officers recognize and address implicit bias. Yet despite these outward efforts, Darius couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still off. He had seen the way people had reacted to the story. Not everyone had supported him. Some had praised his courage, but others, including some within his own agency, had whispered that he was being overly dramatic. There were murmurs of him having played the race card, as if his experience had been some sort of isolated incident blown out of proportion. In private conversations, Darius began to notice the cracks in the facade of support. A few colleagues, who outwardly appeared sympathetic, privately questioned the need for the entire FBI to be shamed over one incident. They had been uncomfortable with the fact that Darius had aired the Bureau's dirty laundry in front of the world. A few even suggested that his actions might jeopardize the reputation of the agency. The underlying message was clear. Darius had made people uncomfortable, and that discomfort had its consequences. As the national conversation surrounding racial profiling and systemic racism reached a fever pitch, Darius found himself constantly in the public eye. He was called upon to speak at rallies, give interviews, and appear on various platforms, all the while holding his ground in the face of criticism. The scrutiny was intense, but he remained steadfast. What kept him going was the knowledge that his words had resonated with people, that his experience had illuminated the injustices faced by many in a way that had never been done before. At the same time, the internal investigation into the hotel security guards was progressing, but the process seemed painfully slow. Darius knew that there were people in positions of power who were hoping the incident would be forgotten. They wanted to move on, sweep it under the rug, and return to business as usual. But Darius wasn't going to let that happen. The guards involved in the incident had been given the opportunity to speak with investigators, but it was clear that they were not fully grasping the severity of what they had done. Through interviews with the guards, it became apparent that they had assumed Darius was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the hotel restroom, despite the fact that he was a trained FBI agent. Their actions were born out of a deeply ingrained bias, a belief that a black man in an upscale hotel could not possibly be someone of authority. When the guards were asked if they would have acted the same way if Darius were white, they hesitated, but Darius could tell they were grappling with the question in a way they had never done before. The uncomfortable silence that followed was telling. It wasn't just about a few bad apples in the security team. It was about a system that allowed these assumptions to thrive. The guards had been following the pattern of behavior that society had set before them, one in which black people were often treated as suspects, no matter their background or profession. As the investigation unfolded, Darius continued to face challenges from within the FBI itself. Some of his colleagues seemed to view his public stance as a threat to their professional standing. A few of them were not pleased with the attention the case was drawing, especially in the middle of such a sensitive time within the Bureau. Darius had been in the field long enough to know that real change often came with a great deal of resistance. The FBI, despite its public commitment to diversity, still struggled with biases that were embedded deep within the institution. While some agents voiced their support for Darius's position, others quietly distanced themselves from him, uncertain about how to respond to the growing controversy. In one particular closed-door meeting with a group of senior agents, Darius found himself once again at the center of a difficult conversation. Some expressed frustration at the disruption his speech had caused, arguing that the FBI's internal problems were not something that should be aired to the public. A few even questioned whether his actions would have a lasting impact, or if they were simply a temporary headline that would fade with time. "It's not about headlines," Darius had said calmly, looking each agent in the eye. "It's about acknowledging that this is happening every day, not just in a bathroom, but in boardrooms, in offices, in every corner of society. The change has to come from within, and if we can't even look at ourselves honestly, how can we expect to enforce justice for others?" The room fell silent at his words. Darius could see that some of the senior agents were uncomfortable, but he also knew that his words had made an impact. They might not change everything immediately, but they were planting a seed of awareness. Despite the internal resistance, Darius was resolute. He knew that the only way to create change was to be the voice of those who had been silenced for too long. He couldn't let the system intimidate him into silence. His experience had already cost him in terms of personal reputation. He had lost the comfort of being seen as just another agent in the field, and had instead become a symbol for something larger, something uncomfortable. But the discomfort he faced was nothing compared to the years of inequality that so many others had endured. The ongoing investigation into the hotel incident continued to drag on, with the guard's fate still unclear. But for Darius, the outcome was no longer as important as the larger conversation that had been started. He wasn't going to let the situation end with an apology or a few disciplinary actions. He knew that the real work, the real fight, was about shifting attitudes, breaking down the biases that still pervaded every aspect of American society. As time went on, the discussions continued, both within the FBI and across the nation. Darius had already made his decision. He was going to keep pushing. He wasn't going to stop until change had been made, until the system that allowed such injustices to fester was dismantled piece by piece. It was exhausting, disheartening, and often isolating. But it was also necessary. The stakes were too high, and the lives of those who had been subjected to racial discrimination were too valuable for him to stay silent. For Darius King, the real fight was just beginning, and he was ready for it. The backlash. Despite the growing support for Darius's call to action, not everyone was on board with his message. The backlash, while inevitable, was more intense than he had anticipated. What had started as a courageous stand against racial profiling had quickly become a lightning rod for both admiration and criticism. As Darius's speech spread across the media, it sparked debates that ranged from impassioned support to outright condemnation. At first, the support was overwhelming. People from all walks of life shared their own experiences with racial profiling, with many recounting how they, too, had been subjected to similar treatment despite their professional status. #profiling or protectors exploded across social media, with celebrities, activists, and ordinary citizens voicing their solidarity with Darius. In interviews and on news shows, he became a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope for those who had felt invisible in a system that often disregarded their humanity. He had taken a personal humiliation and turned it into a rallying cry, and people responded. But as the days wore on, the praise began to shift. Not everyone was happy with Darius's decision to make the incident public. In private conversations, some colleagues at the FBI expressed their discomfort. The whispers began. Had Darius gone too far? Was airing the Bureau's dirty laundry really the best way to create change? More than one senior agent asked if the issue could have been handled more quietly, behind closed doors, without stirring up the media storm that had ensued. It wasn't just within the FBI that Darius encountered resistance. A significant portion of the American public, especially those who felt uncomfortable with the idea of confronting deep-seated racial bias, began to push back. The backlash came swiftly in the form of op-eds, opinion pieces, and social media posts that questioned whether Darius was overreacting. Some detractors argued that his claims were exaggerated, that the guards had simply been doing their job, and that the attention he had garnered was disproportionate to the incident. The most vocal critics were often people who, perhaps unknowingly, benefited from the privilege of not having to confront racial prejudice on a daily basis. Many white Americans, particularly those in positions of power, seemed to dismiss the significance of Darius's experience. They argued that, as a highly trained FBI agent, Darius had nothing to fear, that his public profile made him immune to the effects of racial discrimination. To them, he was simply another successful black man complaining about something that was not a problem in their world. On talk shows and in opinion columns, Darius's motives were questioned. Some went so far as to claim that his speech was an opportunistic attempt to gain attention or publicity. Why did he have to make this a spectacle? One radio host argued, if this had been a white man in the bathroom, would it have been such a big deal? The question made Darius feel the weight of his decision even more. Would they have treated a white man the same way? Would the guards have challenged him, questioned his presence, and humiliated him in front of everyone if he hadn't been black? He knew the answer, even if they didn't want to admit it. And in the face of the growing backlash, he found himself having to justify his own reality, having to defend the pain and frustration that so many people of color felt, but often went unspoken. While he braced himself for these attacks, Darius also began to see something else. People were listening. In the midst of the criticism, there was a growing recognition of the systemic issues at play. His words, uncomfortable as they were to some, had begun to spark difficult conversations. He had given a voice to a problem that had long been ignored, and whether people liked it or not, the conversation was now happening in places it hadn't been before. Even within the FBI, where many had privately expressed their concerns about his public stance, there was a growing awareness that something needed to change. Several agents reached out to Darius, expressing their gratitude for what he had done, for giving voice to the systemic biases that many had been too afraid to talk about. These were not high-ranking officials or public figures. They were the agents on the ground, the ones who were working side by side with Darius every day. And they had begun to recognize the truth of his words. But for every agent who expressed support, there were others who whispered behind closed doors. A few of Darius's colleagues openly criticized his actions, questioning whether his public campaign had undermined the Bureau's efforts to remain neutral and apolitical. They were the ones who believed that, by speaking out, Darius had threatened the very fabric of what the FBI stood for: impartiality, professionalism, and unity. Darius had never been one to shy away from difficult conversations, but this was different. He was now grappling with the internal fallout, balancing the pressure from those within the Bureau who were uncomfortable with his public stance and the need to continue fighting for systemic change. He felt like an outsider, even within the organization he had dedicated his life to. One afternoon, during a closed-door meeting with a senior supervisor, Darius was met with a pointed question. Do you believe that the FBI, as an institution, is inherently racist? The question came out of nowhere, and for a moment, Darius was caught off guard. The supervisor's face was hard to read, but it was clear that the question wasn't being asked out of curiosity. It was a challenge, a subtle attempt to paint Darius's actions as an attack on the institution. Darius considered the question carefully, knowing that his answer would have far-reaching consequences. I believe that the FBI, like any large institution, is made up of people who bring their own biases, consciously or unconsciously, into their work, he said slowly. And if we're being honest with ourselves, those biases influence how we carry out our duties, how we make decisions, and how we interact with the people we're sworn to protect. So yes, I do believe that we have a responsibility to address these biases, not just in the security guards who make mistakes, but within ourselves. The room fell silent, and Darius knew that his words would stir up more discomfort. But he didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to stay silent anymore. The supervisor didn't reply immediately, but the look on his face was one of contemplation, perhaps even recognition. Darius knew that the conversation had shifted. Whether or not the institution would take real action was still up for debate, but at least the seed had been planted. Outside of the FBI, Darius continued to face the public backlash, particularly from those who saw his actions as divisive. Conservative commentators framed him as a race baiter, while others accused him of using his position as an FBI agent to push a political agenda. The online vitriol was intense. Darius received messages calling him a disgrace and embarrassment to his profession. A few even suggested that his speech had been a publicity stunt to further his career. But Darius wasn't interested in defending himself against those who couldn't see the bigger picture. He knew the reality. He had been humiliated, yes, but that was only the beginning. This was about much more than one incident. It was about creating a world where people didn't have to endure the kind of treatment he had faced, simply because of their race. As the criticism continued to mount, Darius found strength in the growing support of those who had shared their own stories with him. Messages poured in from people who had faced similar discrimination, from fellow professionals to ordinary citizens who had experienced the sting of being treated as less than simply because of their skin color. These messages, often filled with gratitude, reminded him that his fight was not in vain. He also found comfort in the small victories that began to emerge within the FBI. More training sessions on racial bias were scheduled, and several of his colleagues expressed interest in learning more about how they could address implicit bias in their work. It wasn't a perfect system, and Darius knew it wouldn't be overnight, but the fact that these conversations were happening was a step in the right direction. The backlash was difficult to bear, but Darius held on. He knew that real change required discomfort. He knew that in order to create a more just society, people had to be willing to face the harsh truths about how racism continued to permeate every level of American life, even in the most unexpected places, and he was ready to continue his fight, no matter how uncomfortable it made the world around him. This was bigger than him. This was bigger than the incident in the bathroom. This was about the future of a country that needed to confront its biases head-on and begin the long road toward true equality. And Darius King, for better or worse, was now at the forefront of that fight. The change. Months passed, and the world seemed to move on, but Darius's life remained very much in the spotlight. What started as a public incident had become the catalyst for something much larger. The conversation about racial profiling had shifted in subtle but important ways. Though the headlines began to fade, and the fervor surrounding his speech started to dwindle, Darius could sense that change was slowly taking root, albeit more quietly than he would have liked. The effects of his actions, while not immediately visible, were beginning to seep into institutions that had long turned a blind eye to systemic bias. Within the FBI, the discussion was ongoing. The higher-ups had officially condemned the incident, but Darius knew that statements were easy to make. True change, however, took time. Despite the backlash, the Bureau had taken significant steps to address the issues he had brought to the forefront. One of the most notable developments was the creation of a department-wide training initiative focused on unconscious bias and racial discrimination. What had initially been a vague concept now had momentum, and every agent in the Bureau, from rookies to seasoned operatives, was required to undergo these sessions. The training was neither short nor easy. It forced agents to confront their own biases head-on, and for many, it was an uncomfortable experience. The sessions delved deeply into the history of racial injustice in the United States, explaining how these issues had become ingrained in American institutions. Darius was among the instructors, taking part in small group discussions, sharing his personal experiences, and providing insight into the ways in which unconscious bias shaped the decisions agents made every day, even when they were not aware of it. The first few weeks of training were rocky, with a lot of resistance from some agents who had never had to think critically about their own biases. Many of them, particularly those who had been in the field for decades, resented the implication that their actions might be influenced by factors they had always believed to be irrelevant to their work. For Darius, this was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the change. It wasn't enough to merely acknowledge that racial profiling and bias existed. People had to be willing to take responsibility for their role in perpetuating these problems. Despite the pushback, Darius was undeterred. He saw this resistance as part of the process. Every conversation, every uncomfortable silence, was an opportunity for growth. Slowly, the agents who had been the most vocal in their opposition began to soften. They were confronted with data, with real stories, with undeniable evidence that their actions had, at times, been affected by biases they weren't even aware they held. By the end of the training, Darius saw a noticeable shift in attitude. There was still resistance, of course, but the conversations were no longer about denying the existence of bias. They were about acknowledging it and taking steps to mitigate its effects. But change within the FBI was not the only shift. Darius had become a national figure, and his story resonated with people far beyond law enforcement circles. Across the country, educators, activists, and even private companies began reaching out to Darius, asking for his input on how to implement similar conversations and training about racial equality in their own organizations. What had begun as an isolated incident had sparked a wave of institutional introspection. Companies were implementing diversity and inclusion programs at a faster rate, and schools were introducing curriculums that addressed racial inequality in more honest and critical ways. However, this widespread attention also brought more scrutiny. Darius had become something of a divisive figure, particularly in the eyes of those who still clung to outdated, harmful ideologies. There were organizations and political figures who took issue with the changes he was championing, and the political climate seemed to further polarize public opinion. But rather than retreating into the comfort of silence, Darius continued his advocacy, using every platform available to him. He wrote articles, participated in panel discussions, and appeared on talk shows, always steering the conversation toward the real, systemic issues that were at the heart of the debate. On the personal front, Darius found himself wrestling with new pressures. He had, at one point, believed that being a successful FBI agent was his greatest achievement. Now he was navigating the complexities of being a public figure, constantly under the microscope, his every move analyzed. The media attention had become relentless, and Darius had to learn how to manage it without losing focus on his core mission. He couldn't afford to become a symbol of anger or frustration. He needed to remain a figure of resilience and determination, someone who could inspire change not through divisiveness, but through unity and accountability. One of the most difficult aspects of his newfound visibility was the strain it placed on his personal relationships. While many of Darius's colleagues were supportive of his advocacy, some felt alienated by the attention he was getting. There were moments of isolation, when Darius realized that despite his accomplishments, his identity had become intertwined with the very issue he was fighting against. He was no longer just Darius King, the FBI agent. He was Darius King, the racial justice advocate. And while he was proud of the work he was doing, there were moments when he missed simply being a colleague, a friend, and a professional. But through it all, Darius found solace in his family and the community that had supported him long before the media storm. His parents, who had always instilled in him the value of standing up for what was right, remained his anchors. They reminded him of the importance of perseverance, of staying true to his principles, even when it seemed like the world was pushing back. One day, as Darius was sitting down for a quiet dinner with his family, his mother turned to him and said, "I know it's been hard, but remember that this fight isn't just for you. It's for every person who has ever had their worth questioned simply because of the way they look." The weight of her words hit him in a way that nothing else had. His struggle wasn't just about proving himself or seeking justice for the wrongs he had endured. It was about breaking down the barriers that had existed for generations, barriers that were built on assumptions, prejudices, and historical injustices. As the months wore on, Darius began to see the fruits of his labor. The training programs within the FBI were just the beginning. More agencies began to adopt similar initiatives, and private institutions followed suit, understanding that addressing systemic bias was not just a moral obligation, it was a necessity. The media, once quick to sensationalize every misstep, began to engage with the topic of racial profiling more thoughtfully. In conversations around the dinner table, in classrooms, and in boardrooms, people were finally talking about race in a more honest way. But perhaps the most profound change came in the form of personal stories. Darius received letters from young people, from professionals, from parents, and from activists who told him how his actions had inspired them to confront their own struggles with inequality. One particularly moving letter came from a young black man who had always dreamed of joining law enforcement, but had been discouraged by the stories of racial injustice that had plagued the system for so long. He wrote that Darius's courage had given him hope, that seeing someone like him, someone who had faced discrimination but had still risen to a position of power, had inspired him to apply to the police academy. For Darius, this was the moment that solidified everything. His speech, his actions, the backlash, the training, none of it had been in vain. The ripple effects of his stand were still spreading, changing the conversation and influencing the next generation of leaders. It wasn't going to be an easy or quick fix, But Darius had become a symbol of the long, difficult road toward a more equitable society. And in that moment, as he reflected on how far he had come, he realized that the most important change wasn't the policies or the training programs. It was the shift in how people saw each other, how they were beginning to understand that racism wasn't just an individual problem, but a societal one that needed to be dismantled from the ground up. The change had started, and Darius was proud to have played a role in it. But he knew the journey was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, still minds to be changed, still systems to be reformed. And Darius was ready, more determined than ever, to continue his fight for a world where no one had to prove their worth simply because of the color of their skin.